Hello and welcome to the Design Intelligence Global SuperCast 2023. In this SuperCast, we're exploring the idea of relevance in the built environment. We've come so far, so quickly in the last few years that as we look back and then again as we look forward and think about relevance, we really want to hear about what has changed, what hasn't changed, what was relevant before, what's most relevant now, and what might be relevant in the very near future. We're joined today by two highly accomplished engineers who have between them many decades of experience in the profession. And today they are going to share their insights with us. We're joined by Dervla Mitchell, who is the Deputy Chair of Arup Group. And we're joined by Ron Klemenczyk, who is the Chairman and CEO of Magnuson Klemenczyk Associates. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great to be with you, Hale.
All righty. Thank you. Dervla, I thought we might begin with you. What your views are about where we are today. You bring such a deep perspective from the aviation industry in particular, but of course across all of engineering in the built environment. What are the things that you've been noticing lately and perhaps you've been contemplating as we're coming through the other side of the global pandemic?
Let me first of all just reflect a little bit on the changes that I've seen and therefore what we face today. So over my career, we've moved from, an industry which worked in pen and paper, literally. We were very much unidisciplined. That was my early experience. And we're now very much multidisciplined. People were focused on outputs. We were going to produce a building or a bridge. And we didn't think much about the outcome or how it worked functionally. And so today, I think we're thinking about not just creating something, as I said, a building or a structure or an airport, but we're thinking about how we can give people an experience. And I particularly like to cite sort of hospital work, because there you're trying to create a very good experience for the individual who's sick and their family, but also hospitals are now, like airports, highly technical buildings filled with lots and lots of complex systems. So I think the world has got much more complex in terms of what we're dealing with. And all those different changes have happened. But being the only woman sitting here, I have to also comment on the fact that we now happily and wonderfully work in a significantly more diverse environment. And I think that's wonderful in terms of the different perspectives and creativity that can now be brought to the problems which we're facing. So that's a little bit on my reflections of, some of the changes I've seen. And the pandemic will have made us think much harder about many of those things, like our lives, the well-being of individuals in all parts of our wonderful planet. I think we're thinking much harder about sustainability, decarbonization, but also now increasingly about nature and how nature and the built environment can be much more integrated. So I think the pandemic has made us focus and think a little bit more also about our legacy. But there's some things that, remain constant. And I think some of those is being really strong technically in our sector, really understanding how things work and also being open-minded about advances in technology and new methods, new ways of working, and whether they be digitization or it be something like robotics in the construction industry. I just think we need to remain curious and open-minded and perhaps better prepared for anything that will come our way in the future.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, Dervla, and a really good summary of the highlights of how the world has shifted so dramatically in the way that we're thinking as a global community now, perhaps more so than ever before. Ron, similarly, you've been practicing in the engineering world for over 4 decades, and you have practiced as well in many different countries, and you've worked on some very large, significant projects as well that have helped establish the presence of the importance of the built environment in the later parts of the 20th century and crossing the millennia into the 21st century. What are some of your observations that you'd like to share, having also been such a dynamic pioneer as has Dervla?
Well, thanks for that. Lots has changed for sure in the last 35, 40 years. Some for the better. Other things, maybe not so much. Maybe we can talk about some of those observations. For the better, the focus and energy and effort being put into decarbonization is really important and really significant right now. Just in the last 2 years, I think, there's been a real groundswell of attention on this topic. Thankfully so, but it's isolated to Europe and the United States. As I travel around to other parts of the world, the interests and emphasis on that topic has not yet caught up, and it needs to, because in places on the Asian continent, in the subcontinent, and even in Africa, it's not really part of the daily conversation yet, and it needs to be very quickly, because this is where lots of the consumption is occurring in the built environment. So the good news is decarbonization is gaining momentum very quickly. So I see that as very positive change. Not to be too negative, but if I give you one example of something that has changed for the worse, I believe, is a reliance too much on prescriptive methods and automation via computers. And what I mean by that is that I'm seeing more and more that design is being somewhat of a lost art, that the ability to have a big idea and then implement that big idea, whether it be an engineering idea or an architectural idea, is being overrun many times by cycling through countless iterations in a computer without that kind of human touch to it. And I feel that's very unfortunate. I'm a true believer that architecture and building creation is expressive of who we are as a people at the time we're alive on the planet. And turning those expressive ideas over to automation, I think is a shame. And so I think that's a trend for the worse, actually.
That's a really interesting observation, especially given, Dervla, you've shared that now there's a greater focus on nature, but it's also overall on the human experience, isn't it? And the importance of human intelligence in this age of machine intelligence and machine learning. And what is that role that we can still develop that's meaningful for the engineering profession today in the 21st century, when we're really in this phase right now where some people would think that perhaps it's pointed in one direction and one direction only, and that's in the direction of rise of the machines. And I really like the fact that you are seriously putting a focus on the value of human intelligence here.
I could agree with Ron, that it is a potential danger to become over-reliant on machines and automation. But I think when we're thinking about our projects, if we're putting the human and, think at the center of our designs, and we think about human-centered design, and we're bringing on board many different disciplines and people with different perspectives, and we respect one another's views and bring them into the design, I think we can achieve what Ron was talking about, was, putting our human creativity absolutely into our projects. So we're agreeing on the problem, and I think agreeing on maybe the solution as well.
Another observation I'd offer, and I mentioned it just briefly, is when I started in the profession many decades ago, the ability to experiment and the motivation to dare to do things new was much more prevalent than today. Today, it seems everything needs to be by a set of rules and by a prescriptive building code. And if you try and do something outside of that list of rules, you run the risk of not being approved or someone objecting to your design or your ideas. And I think it's put a limiter a lot on creativity. Thinking back to the years in the 1960s and the 70s, even before I started practicing, engineers in our company, engineers at Arup, were dreaming big and creating really miraculous structures with really little more than first principles of engineering. And they're still today very profound structures. Today, inside the prescriptive rules that we've written and kind of boxed ourselves in, it would be hard to realize some of those structures today without extraordinary efforts. And I think that's a little troubling as well.
I was watching a program last night on the Empire State Building and the energy, drive, creativity around the design, but also around the construction and its methodology. And three particular individuals who took that forward and what they could achieve in a single-minded way. It exhausted them. But I think looking back at some of those things, I think it does make the point that Ron's making, is that perhaps people were more adventurous and took on bigger challenges. And I think today some of the things that hold us back are things like, not thinking about risk and not thinking about opportunity, and therefore limiting ourselves to what we can achieve. So,
do you think, therefore, that the policy process and the standards process, is it perhaps in need of some streamlining or an examination of that and how it relates to how people are working today to ensure that you can draw out the better work from people and get to better solutions?
Well, in an alternative utopian universe, what I would really dream of is a set of guidelines and regulations that is more performance-oriented on the outcome of a design and the performance of that design, as opposed to prescriptive. If you follow these set of rules, then surely it will be good, because that's not always the case. But unfortunately, I think we're a long ways away from performance-based standards. It puts a lot of reliance and trust on the design professionals, which I think would be a good thing. But from where we are, especially in the United States, with the litigious environment in which we live, it's a big ask to get there.
Mm-hmm. Dervla, when you were working on some of the bigger projects that you've been the lead on, whether that's, say, Terminal 5 at Heathrow or the Athletes' Village for the London 2012 Olympics, mm-hmm. What was the environment that you were working in and amongst? How was ideation and the design process and the collaboration between design and engineering? Was it different then than it might have become in 2020 and 2023?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you choose those two particular projects because they were actually quite contrasting in their approach. So at Terminal 5, we worked under a behavioral contract, and that enabled us, I think, to be much freer in each individual, whether as a person or as a company, to contribute their best thinking and their best working. And I often cite that it was an architectural colleague of ours from Richard Rogers Partnership who actually conceived of the method of construction of the roof, not the contractor. So I think there was something very liberating about that form of behavioral contract that enabled everyone to have a voice. But collaboration as such is something that's really easy to say, but is actually really hard to do. But there we had a really common goal of what we were all trying to achieve together. We left our company badges at the door. We left our insurance constraints and our risk constraints at the door. And a lot of the conversations were around opportunity. And I think that created a completely different atmosphere, which enabled us to think about how do we build it right? How do we design it right? How do we do it in good time? How do we do it for reduced cost frequently? But it allowed us to take many different factors on board as we took a highly complicated design forward. The contrast with the Athletes' Village was that was a highly commercial project. And so most of the discussions were determined by what is the cheapest cost, what's the lowest cost, how do we fit within the commercial model? And therefore I, as a designer, felt I had less to contribute. What gave me huge satisfaction, something like the Athletes' Village, was that actually we were creating Stratford City. We were creating a new city within London. And therefore the motivation was very, very different. But again, working within commercial constraints was tough. And perhaps I'll say personally not my preferred environment within which to work. So I wonder whether, what is it that constrains us from taking on new ways of working? And it was a brave client at Heathrow who enabled us to do what we did. Not many clients are brave. And I think we need to talk to clients about being braver to achieve their outcomes and maybe doing things in a different way, not the usual conventional way. But there's few clients that are like that. So if any clients are listening, they should be thinking about how they do things differently.
Ron, if you're looking at some of your more significant projects that you've been the lead on and been really influential on, Rainier Square in Seattle or Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, those kinds of projects, what kind of environment have you found with your client that's enabled better thinking to emerge, or perhaps it did not?
Those are two similar examples in my experience, and two good examples of good clients and good projects with good outcomes. And kind of key to that, I'm going to use the word trust. And it's the trust not only of the client with the team, but trust amongst the team to work together toward the best outcome. In both of those projects, we, on the engineering design side, did things never done before in the world. And having a client have the trust and willingness to go and travel that path together with us was critical to achieving success. And actually, both clients took a real keen interest in learning about the new technology we were implementing, not just kind of releasing us to do it, but actually getting down into the weeds with us and trying to understand it along the way. So the trust is really the key to all the things that I've been involved in over the years where we've broken new ground. It really is totally reliant on the trust amongst the various parties.
Mm-hmm. I didn't express it like that, but at the T5 project, there was an immense amount of trust. And there was also a client who invested in new technology in that they created a single model environment, so one digital model, which we all worked in regardless of our discipline. And it's taken probably 20 years for that to be more commonly adopted in the construction industry. So it's those clients who want to go on that journey and choose and trust the right partners, and we trust the clients to go with them. So,
yes, that's a really interesting contrast that you both mentioned there, and especially when it comes to trust and the relevance of trust today and at this point in time, when trust in our physical world is often developed through our personal relationship and in-person communication, how we experience each other in a conversation in that way. And in the virtual world, so much of trust is currently based on how well does the technology work? Does the system work quite well? And that gives you a sense of trust. And yet what you've described there, Dervla, about all collaborators working together in a single digital environment does require a high level of trust itself. And perhaps that's on the positive side of how we're working and how we could be perhaps working to a greater degree. So shifting a bit here, and in our final minutes together, as we're looking at the near future, what do each of you think are going to be the areas of the profession that we should really be focusing on to ensure that they remain relevant and are really future ready for what's coming about now as we traverse this big threshold towards greater amounts of quantum computing and AI appearing across all industries? What are your thoughts there?
I listened to the current debate that's going on about the value of AI, machine learning, ChatGPT, all that is to us. And I personally feel it's quite important that we use technology, we learn to use technology well for good. I think there are dangers in over-reliance on technology, so we have to, remain in control. But I think that the problems we face on our planet are becoming increasingly complex, and therefore we need to use all the tools at our disposal to help us address those problems. But, there's positive things. I mean, I think Earth observation is a fantastic opportunity for us all that we perhaps are not yet fully utilizing. We're going to have those satellites moving around our planet. How do we utilize all the information that's going to be gleaned from them to understand, the loss of rainforest, the changing climate? And, with that greater understanding of using that sort of technology, I think we'll make better decisions. So data and well-visualized data actually is what will enable us to make better decisions. So I think I'm sort of keen because we cannot, I described early on how much our sector has evolved over my career. I think we absolutely must continue to positively evolve, but we are aware of the potential risks while we do so.
I believe, kind of going back to something I said earlier, that design of buildings, design of the built environment, it really is expressive of who we are as a people at that point in time in history, who we are as a culture. And I feel very strongly that's best realized collaborating, as Dervla mentioned on her T5 project, everyone together in person. And while we have the technology like Zoom or other platforms to coordinate tasks, the creative process and kind of realizing that goal of the kind of human experience enhancement, I think is really only done well when people are collaborating in person. And so I'm a very strong advocate for working collaboratively in the same space on projects, and not, while I'm certainly flexible on work hours, the work from home hybrid work models I am not in favor of at all, because I think it takes away from our profession, from what we do. I think there are other tasks, other jobs that can be done effectively electronically, but the creative process and the collaborative process across disciplines is best done, I think, together, because the best ideas come from whom they come, when they come, and you can't schedule it. And as Dervila was mentioning, the idea of how to construct the roof at T5 came from not the assigned person. And that's how things happen. And we should encourage that. So I kind of putting the big pitch out there, the call to arms to our design colleagues, that let's all go back and work in our offices, because that's where we do our best work.
Great.
If there are young people listening, I'm giving a talk in coming weeks about my career, and I was reflecting on the things I learned early on. And I didn't always learn them by sitting in the office and being taught them. You learned them by being around more senior people, by hearing things, by understanding the challenges they were facing and seeing how they dealt with it. So that's one of my worries, is that younger people find it easy to work in this electronic world, but actually they're missing out on a huge amount of learning, which will serve them well in future years. And they probably don't realize it yet. So I would call to arms, particularly the young people, to return to the office and learn, which will enable them to be our future leaders in the industry.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us today. Dervila Mitchell from Arup and Ron Klemenczyk from Magnuson Klemenczyk. Thank you both very much for sharing your good thinking and perspective with us. And we wish you well on the very next steps of your journey. Thank you for joining us.